two new members here, Gary and Lynette, and Gary is going to be our navigational engineer here. He's going to press the buttons on my old slide program. We think it'll work because we tried it early, and this is a kind of an amalgam of a slide show that Dick Pugh and I did several times at Northwest conferences at Spokane and Boise, Idaho, and places like that. And we upgraded a little bit, but it's a little bit, well, it's old-fashioned because it's the old slides thing. But you'll have to listen to me, and of course I kind of get in love with my own voice, and you can sneer and laugh and whatever you want to do. Okay, can we have the lights off, please? And press the button. Okay, this of course is what we're looking at. We're looking at pottery, which is now known as stoneware and redware. And when you hold an item like this in your hands, and when you go over it with your fingers, you can feel the hands of the potter. You can feel where his fingers went. You can feel what we call the rills. You can see that this was made by a human being and not by a machine. And you can also see that even though you know nothing about that pottery and nothing about who made it, you do know something about the man who made it, or the woman, as the case may be. And that's what makes it so evocative and so exciting to be looking at the fruits of an old pottery, or the fruits of a pottery industry, before there was the mass production of our period. And hold up, don't go to the next slide yet. But in 1974, I was very much involved in a big project at Fort Vancouver. We had one of our biggest projects ever then. And I was reading everything I could about pottery, about the pottery that we find in the Northwest. And I read in the History of Bancroft, Volume 1, in the appendix, about the biggest pottery in the Pacific Coast. And it was at Buena Vista, Oregon. Now, Buena Vista, Oregon, or Buena Vista as you might pronounce it, Buena Vista, Oregon, what was that? Where was that? Well, on one of my trips to Eugene, I took the ferry, I found it on the map. I found out it's a little town 10 miles south of Independence. And when I went out to the middle of the highest point in Buena Vista, I saw that the moles were operating. And every molehill, very large moles too, every molehill was full of shards. And so I took a box, which I carried in my car at all times, filled it up with with pottery shards, and I took them to, next slide please, I took them to this man. Now, this man I had known for a long time because I was an appraiser of art and antiques for the government, and I had frequently taken things to him. His name was Dr. Dan Sheens. He was the head of the anthropology department at Portland State University. And he took one look at it, nearly fell out of his chair, and it changed his whole life. He had done prehistoric work. He had got his PhD in the Philippines on Philippine pottery, but he really didn't. He was kind of drifting until he saw those shards, and he then was responsible for what I would call the first archaeology of the pottery of the Pacific Northwest, because he organized a bunch of surveys. Much of us from his anthropology department came with us, and we started slowly, basically deciphering the industry that was at Buena Vista, Oregon, which was at one time the biggest pottery company on the Pacific Coast. We learned about two or three weeks, I think, later, maybe months, maybe a couple of months later, that there was a man who was a descendant of that potter, and now you can press the button again. And it was this man, who's still alive, whose name is Blaine Spear. In fact, we have a few books that Blaine wrote, and they're for sale. And talk to Ollie and Cindy, and they'll sell them to you. And he has recently written another book on the potters of Oregon. And I hope when I move away, can you still hear me at all times? Okay, good. Because I have a tendency to move around when I'm up here. And Blaine Schmier has a farm at Peach Cove, about west, somewhat south of West Lynn. And he's created in his barn and in his another building he has there, he's created a museum and a laboratory devoted to this kind of pottery. And we have some of our differences about some things, but I consider Blaine to be the most the biggest expert on this kind of pottery. And next slide, please. Kind of giving you an idea of what we're talking about now. I'm going to move over so you won't hear me as much, but I still have a voice that carries, I think. When we started, with the project with Dr. Sheens and finding Blaine, we only knew of 4 potters in the whole, in Oregon, probably 1 or 2 in the state of Washington. And now our list is even longer than this because we've discovered a new potter at Newburgh and another new potter in the Lebanon area and so forth. But this is an example of all the potteries that we have discovered. And the very first potter was a man named Chevalier Richardson. And let's go on right now. Press button. Okay, one of the little footnotes I have to throw in here at this point is that some of the sites were big enough and there was enough there and it was easy enough to get permission of the owner to actually excavate them. And we did a bunch of excavations and surveys. The Richardson site, the first potter, Pedago, Grove, et cetera. You can read them yourself. Many of the sites we found, however, and Blaine is a professional surveyor, so he was able to verify this. Many of the sites we found were under freeways or were otherwise unavailable. Solomon Way's site, John Richardson's site, the Meyer site was under downtown Oregon City. The Fisher site was close to where Milwaukee begins on the south side. And then the Schmidt site in Cornelius, we never did really find. We found his house and we know where he lived, but that's about as much as we could. However, at that time and even more now, we can clearly identify surviving pots from Richardson, Grove, Harris, Gilmore, Ramsey, the Smith family, and so on, the ones you see there. That's what I'll be showing you, what the real thing looks like, and maybe now you can hear me a little bit better. Next slide, please. First of all, the methodology of collectors for identifying the pottery they find, especially the complete pots, unless they're marked. And incidentally, for the Northwest, only probably 2% of all of the pots were marked in any way. And one of the starting points for determining what the identity of your pot or what the chronology of your pot is was to look at the shape. And this is from a book by Georgiana Greer called American Stonewares. And you can see that she has done an exhaustive survey of this, and that shapes themselves were rather what we call curvilinear or roundish, we'll say, until probably about 1850 to at least the Civil War period. Then we begin to see, for various reasons, in the styles all over the country, really, we begin to see these squarish shapes. Once in a while, we see what we call elongated shapes too. This is a good example of elongation. Potters who ordinarily would have done a squat, a little bean pot, or something like this, were then doing it in a more rectilinear or rectangular style. And that's one of the starting points for basically dating your pots. Looking down here, we see a number of the roundish type pots that could have been or possibly were made before 1850 or 1855 or so. We see a few of the straight backs. And then we see a lot of the very elongated, partly rounded, but mostly elongated pots. And that'll mean more as we look at some of these. Next slide, please. The most important site by far, and Chuck and Allison did lead some groups in the vicinity of this area, but unfortunately didn't get to it until after we had done a lot of surveying, was the Chevalier Richardson site near Damascus. Richardson came to Damascus before 1848, about 1846, was actually in the Cayuse War. And then in 1848, he started his pottery. And some of the first excavations we did, Blaine is a marvelous reconstructor of pottery. He took 3 items of what we thought were Chevalier Richardson at that time. And Richardson's pots were all in the what I would call the curvilinear old style. And Blaine and I actually spent 2 weeks in the Midwest, and 3 of the days were spent at the Richardson site in western Indiana, and we saw the same thing there too. But basically, it was a very thin pottery. It was redware. He had it was 7.5% by weight of iron oxide, which was made it more like a brick constitution than a pottery constitution. And ominously, he glazed all of his stuff with a lead glaze. And the evidence of the lead glaze was everywhere, including even in Richardson's smoking pipe. Well, he started his pottery in the year 1848. By 1854, he began to have hallucinations. He killed one of his neighbor's cows because he thought it was a monster coming to get him. And he was declared insane. In those days, there was nothing like a place to put the insane, or there was just the beginning of one in Portland, but he didn't qualify. And so he was put up with by various farmers in the Oregon City, Gladstone area. The last man he lived with was Rynearson, well-known early settler in the Oregon City area, and he walked away from the Rynearson site in about 1856 and was never seen again. But he was an excellent potter, and we have one item down here which Blaine had identified as a Chevalier Richardson that may go back to about 1849 or so, if it's authentic, and that would make it extremely rare. As you can see, Blaine's skill at putting things together was very good. However, one little thing that happened there subsequently. From looking at these items and looking at them more carefully, we discovered that this was Chevalier Richardson, circa 1849. This was 1849. This, however, was Samuel Grow. Samuel Grow was another potter who came to the Damascus area. But Samuel Grow didn't come to the Damascus area until about 1856, actually. And there's other characteristics we'll see of Grow when we come to that make that very early and very interesting. Next slide, please. Okay, here's an example of an even more distinctive potter, and Ollie has a good example of this pair. This is from the Harris brothers, who operated between 1856 and 1858 in the Kanema area of south of Oregon City, and they had come from central Ohio, Zanesville area, and they had a characteristic. If you go back to the Midwest, as I have, and you go to the Zanesville area, as I pass through, you see that a lot of their early pottery before the 1850s had this collar. And this collar is really the trademark of the Harris brothers. They had a very good pottery going for 2 years, from 1856 to 1858. But the story goes that the younger Harris, John Harris, got drunk, let his kiln have a meltdown, which did really ended the pottery completely for them, and they never rebuilt it. Ruined the whole kiln load. They had probably burned and sold something like 5 or 6 kiln loads before that, and maybe one of them is the one that Ollie has. That the very largest straight back piece there is probably a Harris Brothers piece. Next, please. Okay, another potter that lasted a little bit longer, came later and lasted a little bit longer, was a German. His name was Charles Fisher, and he came to the Milwaukee area, the area pretty close to where, if you take McLaughlin Boulevard, you start climbing the hill, from Milwaukee itself, and they had a big plant there, pottery plant, from 1880 to actually about 1920. And if you ever took the old interurban car, the interurban was elevated then, and it passed right by their pottery works. And how did they survive? Well, it's hard to guess how they did survive, but they seemed to survive by having a very finely made pottery, stoneware, and in very small items. And the Oregon Historical Society has about 20 of their pieces. And I'm told that I do too. I in an antique shop, I saw one that was unquestionably 19th century. I bought it, and I've checked now the glaze and the composition, and I'll show you how I did that a little bit later. And it's a Fisher. Fisher pottery is rare, probably because it was small and relatively delicate. Next, please. Okay. Little preview here of what we're going to get to, and that is a more technical way of identifying the pottery for the potters and for the collectors like Ollie, who I think is a serious collector, and I think will find this kind of approach much better. About 2 years after Dr. Sheens died, we got a grant from the geology department at Portland State University, thanks to Dick Pugh. We got a grant to have this pottery tested at the Reed College nuclear reactor using neutron activation analysis, which gives you the parts per billion in the composition of the composition. You can't do any better than that. So we selected a number of samples, and we had all of this pottery tested for 25 elements, 25 trace elements, which were what we call fingerprint elements, and 2 minor elements, which were basically sodium bisodium oxide and iron oxide. Iron oxide is especially important. And we with our charts and doing what is called cluster analysis and factor analysis, going crazy, resurrecting all my old college statistics textbooks and so forth, we discovered that we had some really interesting differences in the kinds of clay. And I'm not going to go into all of them, but we saw that some of them had high amounts, trace amounts of certain elements that distinguished the various kinds of trays. And we applied that first to the various potters we had in Clackamas County. And you can see some of the, for example, the Pentago site in Damascus, the Chevalier Richardson site in Damascus, which were close and may have used the same water, had virtually the same important trace elements on the high side. On the low side, neodymium is a very rare element for any clay, so that kind of sent the Pentago part of it away. And if we could test this, for example, test one of these pots non-destructively, which we can with X-ray fluorescence, we would find that whether or not it met the standards for the clay. A clay like this one with zinc and arsenic and who's a chemist? what's SB? It's been a while since I did this. Antimony. Antimony. So with high trace elements, amounts of zinc, arsenic, and antimony, we had the kind of clay that we had at the Samuel Grove site in Damascus, if you understand how that works. So what we do now, I have a master list. Blaine has not been too interested in that because it doesn't always agree with his with what he attributes. But now we have a master list, basically, of the kinds of clays that were used by the early potters, and that's very valuable because neutron activation involves a little sample about the size of a dime has to be powdered and then it's destroyed. However, all of these other pots can be tested with X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, which is non-destructive, and you can get the same results. Well, what do I mean? Well, if Ollie had if he had a Todd, for example, Todd is the only potter in the state of Oregon who was known to have a pottery clay that was rich in chromium, for example, basically as a trace element. And that's important because we know that the place that Todd did his pottery happened to be in the county near Roseburg, and I forget the name of the county, but that happens to be an area where there are chromium ore mines and things like that. So doing this testing that we did, gradually now we have a tool for authenticating anything. A local, MEI Charlton, which is a local testing laboratory, will test a sample like this non-destructively for about $15 or $20. And so you can get roughly the same results, not as precise as neutron activation, but roughly the same results. Next chart. Okay, now, going on to Polk County, and we're into the territory of the really big pottery, Buena Vista. Incidentally, when I discovered all those shards in the molehills, the nearest neighbor came running over to me to see what I was doing because I was in front of the Methodist church, and I said, well, I didn't know you had a pottery in Buena Vista. He said, don't call it Buena. Or don't call it Buena, it's Buena Vista around here. And so and he was kind of a very firm voice on that. But at any rate, that's where the biggest pottery was established by Amity Smith Jr. And one of the wares they did was decorated with cobalt oxide, making it probably one of only two or three, well, counting Solomon Way decorated his too, that actually decorated the outside of their pottery. And these are examples of two of the churns, I think, that Blaine has that are decorated. Next slide, please, from Buena Vista. This is another potter, probably what we call the Prince of Potters, the best potter we ever operated in the Northwest. He was operating in Eola, which is just to the west of Buena Vista. His name was Solomon Way. He was a Quaker, he was very precise, and Blaine and I, when we went on our trip to the Midwest, we located his house and his farm and so forth in Iowa, but there was no pottery there. We did have records, though, to indicate that he did some potting there, and he was very careful and a very good potter. He made these multicolored effects by realizing that he had, among his iron oxide clays there, he had some hematite clays and some limonite clays. Limonite basically is used by Native Americans and others as a pigment source for yellows and oranges and this sort of thing. And so Solomon Way, with his careful way of filtering the clays and then using the slips for his glazes, made wonderful designs like this. Interestingly enough, he competed with Buena Vista pottery in the state fairs, several of them, and he always won. he always beat them. It got to the point where Amity Smith of Buena Vista, Oregon Pottery Company, would instead of trying to sell his goods to the state fair on the basis of their beauty, he started demonstrating that his were so hard and so durable that he could actually drive a 10-penny nail into a plank using his pottery. Now that's tough, but it worked, and his pottery was very good too. Solomon Way was old though when he started his pottery, so he quit after 1868, sold his pottery to a man named Richardson, no relation to the earlier Richardson, and moved to down to the Roseburg area. Next, please. Okay, here's a good example of. Let's see, make sure that I have it right here. This is a good example of one of the most prolific potters of all. One of the best written up is Barnett Ramsey, who was operating in two places, Spicer and in Muddy Creek, which is close to Shedd, Oregon, and he operated for many years. We excavated his sites in a way, although a lot still remains there. The landowner, that was one of those landowner issues. Landowner was letting us dig because he thought we would be coming up with some whole plots, but we didn't. But we did establish very well that this was the Muddy Creek site was one of Barnett Ramsey's sites. Next, please. And here's another. This is another example of Barnett Ramsey. Barnett Ramsey was really a very fine potter, and the one outstanding characteristic he actually worked in all the styles you see there. And the one Barnett Ramsey they have, the very small one, is an example of him working in one of the older curvilinear or rounded styles. But he was actually very good. The real trademark for him, though, was if you look closely at the body, you see little platelets or flecks of what we call micaceous schist. In other words, like little gold, like little having gold flakes in it or something like that. And that was his trademark. And he used a clay which he called the blue muck, but it fired to a good, kind of a buff stoneware. And he also did a lot with what we call a lucky butte slip to glaze his pottery. Incidentally, most of the redware needed to be glazed. It was too porous. If you made a redware jug or something that was supposed to contain a liquid, it would leak because it was too porous unless you glazed it all the way. And so that was one of the reasons why they sought out several kinds of glazes. The two most popular were lead glazes, which were dangerous, but also salt glazes, which involved throwing a little bit of salt into the kiln when you were firing the items. Next, please. Okay. Talked a little bit again, very briefly. I don't want to get hung up on this, but about the composition. And this is a lot of this is for Ollie's purposes. Here again, Ollie, take a look at the high trace elements. Look at the differences in those bodies. Now, on the other hand, the actual external or macro look at those potters, they're pretty much the same. Barnett Ramsey did pretty much the same work at Muddy Creek as he did at Spicer, and Clymer and Thompson and the others who worked at that site, they fired the same kind of shapes. They all influenced each other when it came